Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell with a conversation that makes for one of our most popular episodes every year, and that's our year in review. After all, it doesn't matter how much we plan, there's always going to be new products to try and new problems to solve. And of course, that doesn't even factor in the curveball that the weather can throw at you. To navigate what went well and what we might be able to try to figure out for 2024 for Ontario growers, we've got two great pioneer agronomists. Paul Hermans covers an area of Eastern Ontario. Greg Stopps covers a chunk of Southwestern Ontario. Paul, Greg, thanks for joining the podcast.
Great to be here, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having us back on.
Now, I want to save the, big finale, which is how did yields turn out, for a little later in the episode. What I'd love to do is let's go through the year in a chronological order here and see just what we learned as we went through things. Paul, let's start in Eastern Ontario. How did the planting season go for most growers in your area, and what do you think a few learned along the way?
Sure. I guess, Andrew, the biggest thing is sometimes we have a short-term memory, and it's good to kind of flip back the calendar and go back through the growing season. So if I go back to May, we had a little bit wet there at the start. Really didn't get going until about May 9th, 10th in the area. But, man, things changed quick after that. After about a week of planting, we got really dry conditions. It got windy, and growers really had to watch their planting depths as we got to that later planted, soybeans and corn to make sure that the crop got up. Then it was, going into that June time frame, into July, it was looking like it was going to be really dry. And in Eastern Ontario, we were always worried about mold and everything else. But then the taps turned on. We got more issues with mold and other diseases, especially in soybeans, root rots, and that kind of stuff. So it was a challenging year from the get-go, and it seems to be that way almost every year, that we really got to take a look at the crop and manage it moving ahead.
Now, in terms of, if we go back to that planting, when you do have that variability from, those first few fields that you plant where maybe it's a little damp and then it gets too dry and then it gets too wet all along, what's the impact in terms of, did you see any issues that really arise when we talk about, planting depth, when we talk about, just having things set right when you first go in the field?
We didn't see too much, and I think it's, that's, kudos to the growers. It was that finer attention to detail, really watching that planting depth, getting in the moisture. I think we've driven home that message, and growers in the area are starting to realize that, which is great. So didn't see too much issues there. Overall, our plant stands were, I was going to say bang on, within 95% of what we put down, so that was good to see.
Then, Greg, in Western Ontario, what was the story like in terms of, especially, as growers started planting in 2023?
Yeah, so I think we shared a lot of similarities probably this year when it came to planting with the East. Most of us, like Paul kind of said, didn't get going till kind of that second week of May. There was a small segment of growers who did actually get started in end of April, very beginning of May. Things turned a little bit wet on us after that, and conditions weren't quite ideal until we got going later on in May. In terms of your question about, what kind of differences do you see? We did see some differences between stuff planted early, end of April kind of timing this year. In terms of emergence, very slow to emerge as we kind of went forward. And then even at the end of the season in the crop, some differences that came out between early planting and the bulk of the planting that went on through the middle of May. We had great conditions as we went through the middle of May. Beautiful for planting. A lot of corn went in the ground very quickly, beans to follow, so much so that I think, there were times where we were worried about spray applicators keeping up with pre-emerge chemistries and everything else. But we made it through that season pretty well. As we kind of progressed to the end of May, though, things got quite dry, like Paul said, and it was for those who were still doing beans, it even got to that point where, how deep do you plant them? What's the strategy? Because moisture has slipped away at that point in time. And that was stressful for a lot of growers planting at the end of May and into June, trying to do some replants and things like that as well. Certainly more stressful in southwestern Ontario, too, as you get out into the edible bean crops that surround us as well, because those are a little bit more finicky as you get into discussions of planter depth, right? How deep can you go? But that provided some some significant stress to growers through what was otherwise a really smooth planting season.
So here's a question that I heard in the neighborhood, or the discussion that happened in, kind of through that, as it got, as you said, Greg, got really, really dry. So I'm going to pose this question to you guys and get the right answer from you two experts. Is some growers left it, said it's too dry, I can't get deep enough, there's no moisture, I'm going to wait for moisture and then plant. And other growers said, no, I'm going to put it there so it sits there, and when it rains, then it's going to be ready and it's going to germinate. What's the right thing to do?
Any agronomist would probably tell you it depends, Andrew. And it depends on the forecast and what your moisture level is like. But in most cases, we were still able to get down to moisture. In corn, we used to always talk about a 2-inch planting depth. Well, now we're talking go a little bit deeper, 2.5, 2 3/4, up to 3 inches if we have to get to that moisture. I'd rather search for that moisture, and the same thing in soybeans. But in general, it's watching the forecast, seeing what's going to go on, and kind of playing that game. So again, I know it sounds crazy, but it depends on a lot of different variables out there.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. I'm glad he went first to say it depends. That's I think it really does, right? And I would say there is a limit in my mind in terms of how deep you can go responsibly, right? And the worst thing you can do is go deeper trying to search for moisture, and especially with soybeans, put a bean on moisture only to watch that slip away, because that's trouble. Usually those beans will imbibe a little bit and then not get going, and they'll sit there 4 or 5 days and they'll be done. So we really don't want to kind of put them on moisture. We want to put them solidly into moisture, and that can be really tricky as that moisture continues to slip away. The one thing I would kind of say in my mind where it really does depend is what's your soil type. And so what's the right thing to do? If you're on some sandier ground, that ground that dries up fairly quickly after a rain event, I'm not rushing to put those beans out into dry storage so that they're sitting there waiting for moisture. But if I'm on a harder ground, like a clay, that gets really muddy and really gross, well, maybe I am putting them into dry storage there waiting for that rain, because you have to factor in, how long is it going to be until I can get back on that field realistically, right? And if you're already sitting, beginning of June and you're waiting for a rain event that's coming in another week, right, then you're talking about middle of June. And if it rains and it's snotty enough that you can't get the planter going on that, right? And we are seeing rain events that are larger and heavier in terms of the volume that we're typically seeing. So it means that you're out of the field a little longer. And if I'm looking at kind of having those beans there ready to take that up, I'm going to maybe make that gamble on some of those soil types.
So then, and that's really what we did see for, our area anyway, was all of a sudden the taps did turn on. I think you mentioned that. You had the same thing, Paul. What kind of came after that? Crops coming up, things must have looked, decent. Stand counts were good. What followed for growers in your area, Paul?
Well, I think the one big thing in June, as you recall, Andrew, was that the smoky haze, right? The wildfire, we had a lot of concern about that. Lack of solar radiation. We started getting the June, July, our heat units were behind and everything else. We had lots of questions from growers. Is this going to affect our crop? So that was one big play. And then when we got into that July time frame there, I always talk about, if the grass is green, white mold's going to be keen. If the grass is brown, it's going to be down. Well, we had green grass, and then we got into that mid-July, and the taps just really didn't turn off. A lot of days I can remember walking soybean fields and to come out right in the middle of noon, and your pants were still soaking wet from the humidity and everything else. So that was really a conduit for that disease in white mold, and that was probably the big story our way was white mold. But a lot of guys too, we thought we had mold, but there's other mimics out there. We had a lot of phytophthora root rot in the area, fusarium root rots, different root rots, and then different diseases later on that look like mold. So, it's really attention to detail, knowing what those diseases are, how do you manage, what seed treatment rotation to kind of help us, for next year going forward.
Greg?
Yeah, so once those taps came on, we saw a lot of disease pressure, like Paul alluded to. And again, this is one of those odd years where I think the East and Southwestern Ontario were very similar, maybe a little bit different in terms of our overall pressure. But like Paul said, we had a lot of precipitation, which kept those canopies really wet. When that occurred kind of early in July, a a lot of our soybean crop was still growing very rapidly vegetatively, which meant we had a lot of stretch between those internodes. So we ended up with tall, fairly lanky plants that closed in a really thick canopy, which didn't allow some of that air to breathe. And then all that moisture on top of things as we continued through a wet July into a rather damp August meant there was going to be pressure from disease. And white mold was a big, significant portion of that. But I'd also say, like Paul mentioned, there's a whole host of other diseases that slipped in. We saw some of the drier root rots as things established early in June. We saw some of the wet root rots that came about in July. We saw other mimics and things of white mold too develop over the year. Down here we saw a lot more Diaportha or Phomopsis, as it used to be kind of called. It showed up, and you could see that at the end of the year, and it all kind of mimics and looks the same with those hanging petioles as you're harvesting through it at the end of the year. But we saw a lot of disease pressure. And in corn, the corn crop took all that rain and just shot up. We saw ear placement really high, really tall crop down here this year, and that was a good thing, but certainly can stress the crop if you get a short season in the fall because you got really high ear placement, right? And physics then work against you. But for the most part, both crops handled it fairly well from a yield potential standpoint. And even the third big crop down in southwestern Ontario with wheat handled some of the drought stress fairly well, except for on really light ground, and seemed to really capture that rain right when it needed. And the temperatures weren't too hot, so grain fill was kind of ideal for even the wheat crop this year at that same time.
So then when we do talk about disease, I think that's one thing that we've talked several episodes over the last few years in terms of how to manage these diseases that, obviously white mold's been around for a long time. It's just the question of, is it worse or better? Is it worse? Do we need to be spraying fungicides? What's the right answer? Paul, in Eastern Ontario, is a year like this kind of that year that solidifies a lot of growers that says, fungicide may be the answer all the time moving forward?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's a lot of things that our growers are looking at from a white mold standpoint, and it comes back to, tillage, variety type, fungicide, the list kind of goes on, population, row widths and everything else, and there's a lot of soul searching out there. How can I manage this next year? The big thing is we had, you think about a disease cycle, you need the host, you need the pathogen, you need the environment, and the environment this year was the biggest player overall. Are we going to have that again next year? Who knows? Like, if I could figure that out, I'd be a millionaire and be on a different podcast, Andrew. But quite frankly,
are you saying you want to be on a different one than ours,
Paul? No, this is a great
one.
A great one.
Who are you kidding, Paul? If you were a millionaire, you'd still be here with us. That's good.
The fungicide thing, though, quite frankly, we saw response, especially with a 2-pass system this year. There's even some growers are thinking about in low-lying areas that are more prone within the field, different zones, actually maybe looking at going in a 3-pass system. So there's differences out there, but definitely people are looking at the fungicide and the benefit that it brought this year going forward.
Greg, is it the same in Western Ontario? Particularly on the corn side, I think we saw a big difference on a year like this.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm a big believer in fungicide for the most part, but the agronomy answer again is it really depends, right? And it depends on the disease you are looking at specifically, right? And we've started to adopt fungicide application in some crops fairly heavily. It's kind of a no-brainer to do it in wheat at heading. We started to see more adoption in soybeans for white mold. You're even starting to now see that adoption of the 2-pass system, which 10 years ago it was hard enough to get them to spray one. Now they're kind of seeing the benefit of that, right? And that's driving some big yield differences and quality differences in those crops, and that's fantastic. I would say, specifically with beans and corn, though, we are seeing, especially in corn, a little less clear picture to fungicide. Beans, they seem to show a very clear picture. They do a very good job at keeping those fields clean of the diseases that we're targeting. Diseases like tar spot in corn, very clear cut that fungicides are a huge help, right? And we saw that this year. They're going to need to be very strong part or serious consideration of a management program for folks in hard hit areas where we know tar spot's overwintering and continuing to expand. But with other diseases, it remains a little bit less clear cut. And the reason I kind of go there is, in my own mind, I struggle at times with how good some of our fungicides really are. They tend to keep the plants very green, very healthy. That's a good thing from a yield standpoint, but that can be a negative thing from a moisture standpoint. And in southwestern Ontario, as in eastern Ontario and Quebec, like, we don't have the luxury that the Corn Belt does, getting that dry down, right? It's, we've had a few years where we've managed to harvest below 25%, but most of us are harvesting our corn at above 25%. And the Great Lakes provide a lot of cloud cover and a lot of unpredictability in our falls. So getting that consistent dry down can be a struggle. And when you have fungicides applied that keep your moisture up a little bit, it can compound some things, right? It can either cost you a little bit more on the back end with drying, or sometimes I think with diseases like gibberella ear mold and the production of dawn, those extra points of moisture can be a serious consideration, right? Because you're going to have a little bit more proliferation of that dawn, potentially, especially if you're not using fungicides that don't have modes of action that target that disease, right? And there are a number of them out there that are really good on plant health, but don't have that triazole component to potentially suppress that. So it all depends, right? Big believer in fungicides, definitely from a yield perspective and from a quality perspective. Just not always completely clear cut on individual disease in southwestern Ontario because of our environment.
So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of shelve that conversation in terms of how we use these lessons for 2024, because I think the spray program in particular is one I'd love to discuss, in how, going through the winter, do we kind of at least make a plan for what some of the options might be. But first, you kind of mentioned the fall conditions in terms of what moisture's like. Let's talk harvest. How did, after all those ups and downs, Paul, in Eastern Ontario, how'd things turn out?
Well, I would say, wow, fantastic, amazing for Eastern Ontario. And Andrew, we kind of compared the plots that we did in 2023 compared to 2022. Generally, we're on the same growers, same soil types, same hybrid varieties. On the beans, we were about 4 to 5 bushels higher than 2022, which is amazing, because 2022 was an amazing year. And then on corn, we were about 16 bushels higher. So a lot of record yields. We still have some corn to come off in Eastern Ontario. The bins are full right to the brim. That kind of tells you the story. So overall, impressed with the corn and soybean yields that we got this year.
Greg, are your growers as thrilled as Paul's?
Well, Paul always has a lot of excitement going on, and I think on the corn side of things, most people are really happy. I think there was a significant portion of late August, early September, where admittedly the corn crop was quite stressed. It was cloudy. A lot of fields looked like they kind of shut down early and did shut down. Some were forced to brown layer. But we've been impressed with how well the crop has stood standing. We've been lucky with some of the weather we've had to finish things off. And there is a tremendous amount of yield in the corn crop, more than we anticipated. But I would say down here, probably not record setting. Really good and higher than average, but not record setting everywhere. Some may have set records on their own individual farms, which is awesome. I don't see the yields being quite as high as 2022 or 2021, which was probably our best year, but they probably came close. And the main point there is none of us were anticipating that. So it was really good. Yields are there. Test weight is the one thing that probably took that top end off for us. Some of that stress through September and October, just how the plant shut down. There was a number of fields that just didn't pack as much test weight on as they probably should have through that grain fill period. And that's understandable given the conditions that we were in. They still did fairly well considering. On the soybean side of things, I would say this was not a record-setting year for us. Some people definitely had really good success with their beans and managed through some of those stresses. Down in southwestern Ontario, it wasn't an average year, but it was a lot closer to kind of that 10-year average where we saw yields back in the 50s and nowhere near as many fields that were yielding those mid-60s and into mid-70s. A lot of them were back in that kind of mid-60 to mid-50 range. And then as you get into kind of the IP crop, it wasn't wasn't uncommon to see kind of those 45s to mid 50s, right? And that's a normal kind of relative range between the technology segment in beans and the IPs, but certainly a little lower than we've seen over the last few years.
Then you had mentioned Dawn and Gibberella and that, like what from a quality, beyond test weight, what from a quality standpoint did both of you find in the corn crop?
So we didn't have, hardly any Gib or Dawn issues at all here in Eastern Ontario. We're lucky that way. It's just not the environment that we have, thank God. But the one thing that we did do, Andrew, was looked a lot at kernel weights. So how many kernels per bushel did it take this year? And we had just phenomenal kernel weights. So normally we talk about 85 or 90,000 kernels per bushel. We did a bunch of work on plots and everything else, and we're getting, in that 73 to 75,000 kernels per bushel. So it took a lot less kernels basically to get that yield, and that's where we saw that this year. And that's going back to the year that we had, right? We didn't get a frost at all, basically, until late in the growing season. That helped us have a longer window to pack more starch and energy into that grain, and that's where a lot of our grain from the corn standpoint came from.
Yeah, and so down here in southwestern Ontario, like we did see Gib again. It seems like the last main outbreak we had was 2018, and we'd all like to kind of forget that, I think. That was one of the largest outbreaks we've had in a long time. This year was not on the same scale, although I will say regionally in some of those hotspot areas, or for growers who are in areas that maybe haven't experienced as much of it before, as kind of those geographic patterns shift a little bit, it may have felt that way for them, right? We did have some significant areas of high dawn, geographically not as widespread as 2018, and even from a dawn concentration standpoint, nowhere near as high as some of the levels we saw in 2018. And that is, I think, both a function of environment, where we didn't have quite as much pressure as we did in 2018, but it's also a reflection of where the market has shifted in terms of tolerance to Gib ear mold in some of the hybrids that are out there, as well as management and awareness of the issue, both by the end users and the elevators, as well as by the growers, right? Having been bitten more recently by that 2018 outbreak. Pioneer, we've made a move to having a couple hybrids that are actually really strong performers at the maturities that are typically hit hardest in those hot spots, kind of in that 100-day maturity zone. And those two platforms can carry a considerable amount of volume and a considerable amount of acres that are out there, and they both perform exceptionally well. Gib is a very tricky disease. It's not all down to hybrid, but having a hybrid and selecting the right hybrid that does have some tolerance is really, really important. And we've kind of stumbled into, it's not easy to find these hybrids that have a really good Gib response, but we've kind of hit on a couple that were working really, really well. And I'd say our breeding organization has empowered us in southwestern Ontario to be able to say no to experimental hybrids that are coming forward with abnormally high Gib responses, right? So we're not exposing our customers because we're really paying attention, right? By trying to make sure the hybrids that come forward in this environment for customers who are purchasing them here are relatively low risk. And that's not perfect across the entire lineup, but then, there's the awareness piece. And a lot of growers who had hybrids that may have been a little higher risk, who knew it and were willing to take those risks, simply got into those fields a little faster and managed through that, right? And the best thing we can do for that is get those fields harvested, get that grain dry so that the dawn doesn't continue to proliferate. And a number of fields came off earlier than we'd like to see them, and were far more expensive to dry than we would really like to see, but it stopped a lot of that problem in its tracks versus not knowing what we had out there, which is largely what we had in 2018, and waiting until late November, December, and allowing that problem to get worse and worse by the day, every step of the way, right? So I think we've done a really good job managing that this year and limiting our overall exposure. So, well done to the growers out there, well done to the agronomists that are everywhere who helped coach people through those things, because it can be a very tricky issue and one that can keep coming up every year for southwestern Ontario.
So then with that, I mean, it's a great example of, what's been learned in a year like 2018 and how to manage it and what we can do differently so that we can do a better job going forward. What are a couple of the big key takeaways from you, Paul, for that whole growing season? It ended up tremendously well for all the ups and downs. What are you taking away that you're going to make sure when growers are making their plan for 2024, they know about?
So I think one big thing is don't farm this year's weather. If I took a look at soybeans as an example, the 04s and 06 maturity did the best in our area. Normally the 09s won too, but that's just a function of when it was flowering, when the mold came in, the solar radiation when we had it. So if you want to predict, for next year, the future, it's best is to look at a lot of data. Look at 2-3 years of data, agronomic data and everything else, and kind of go from there. And then we only have one chance to plant this crop. Let's do it right. Let's not mud it in. Give Mother Nature a chance and the crop a chance to get going. And then don't give up on the crop. We've had a lot of different ups and downs this year, from the haze to the white mold to the weed control. And you go back and say, oh my God, it's not going to make it, the crop. But at the end it did. And it's those guys that took the time to manage it, put a fungicide on or extra weed control or whatever it may be, that got that extra yield at the end of the day. And then I always come back to try something new. There's a whole bunch of different, products, as an example, biologicals out there, new seed treatments, corn population. Try a few small acres on your farm and try and take it to the next level. And, Greg and I are on here as experts, but we got our Pioneer sales team out there, the sales reps. They really know your local area, what's going on, products. Sit down over the winter time, get them to help you and come up with a plan and have, plan A, B, and C, because sometimes things go wrong. If you do all that, I think you're going to set yourself up for a big win in the 2024 season.
Yeah, and I'd echo a lot of those same comments. I think, Paul's absolutely right. We only get one chance to plant this crop, right? So let's make sure we're picking the right hybrids, the right varieties for our risk portfolio or risk tolerance, right? Make sure and are aware of the diseases and things that can be a problem year over year in your area. Make sure you're picking the right relative maturities too, right? I don't like to farm this year's weather next year, but certainly, you can look back over 10 years and learn some lessons in terms of, if I'm pushing too far beyond in certain relative maturities, I have run a higher risk of getting bit. And we saw some growers get bit a little bit this year because of the way the fall went. Higher relative maturities that we've been pushing and been able to push over the last few years just didn't quite succeed this year. But I don't know if they'll do that next year. So balance your portfolio. Make sure if you're going to push really heavy into later maturing hybrids or full season beans, make sure you have some that are maybe not quite as full season too, right? To manage your risk. And like Paul said, you got to manage this crop, or at least you got to plan to manage this crop. I don't know if next year is going to be a high white mold year. I don't know if it's going to be a high risk jib year in corn. But I've got a plan to have that management strategy in place so that I'm ready to pull the trigger when I need to, because a lot of these diseases are very time sensitive. And that's actually really true as we get into tar spot, which we haven't talked about much, but certainly south end of London in southwestern Ontario saw a lot of tar spot. And guys are going to need to plan for that. And in our current economic environment, return on investment is really important. Knowing what that bottom line is, budgeting, because we are seeing margins shrinking for a lot of farm operations. You have to look ahead and you have to budget in what's most important so you can make sure you get that return on investment. Because if you got something like tar spot that can steal 80 bushels from you without a fungicide in a hurry, then you want to make sure that you're spending that little bit extra on the fungicide, right? And getting that on at the correct timing to limit the yield impact. And that's true of any disease that's out there. Manage it and make sure you have a plan. Make sure either it's on order or in the shed, whether you have to use it or not, so that you can go out there and get it done in a timely manner. That's a big lesson that can be learned year in, year out, regardless of what the weather does, because then you're at least prepared to deal with whatever the weather throws at you.
Well, and that brings up, for me as a grower, as I enter into what is now going to be meeting season with a whole bunch of conferences and meetings and all that type of stuff. Is that one of those questions I should be asking when I'm sitting in a room with experts like yourself? Like, in terms of, what's the best spray program that I should be looking at in scenario A, B, and C? Or what do you think is that question that I should be asking when I'm sitting and an expert's up front in a room?
Yeah, I think, you should take advantage of having experts, or not just individual experts, but a host of them, right? Put a good team in your corner, right? And like Paul says, we've got some great sales reps and great salespeople across all of Eastern Canada that know local geographies and performance, and can predict performance of varieties or hybrids way better than Paul or I necessarily can on that kind of in-depth level, right, for your area. So get their opinion, get the opinion of other experts out there. Take advantage of asking those questions, right? Whether it's, like, when do I look to apply? How do I do this? How do I scout for this? What kind of products are best? What kind of rates, right? There's no one recipe that seems to fit every operation, right? And that's evidently clear from all the years I've been doing this. Some people are going to have different weed portfolio, or kind of weed spectrums in their fields, right? And they're going to need different herbicides than the next person, right? So that may drive you choosing one technology over another. That may drive your individual chemical choices, right? Some are going to have different disease risks than others, or different fertility histories that are going to change how you manage the crop and how much input you put into it. Ask those questions of the individuals, right? Come to the table prepared too. So bring forward what you are doing now and how you're managing things, and be open to listening to the experts. And like Paul said earlier, be open to trying something new. And that's not just new in terms of hybrids and varieties, but new in terms of management practices, right? The more we open ourselves up to kind of that experimentation, to take a look at kind of the baseline we've set for management now with what we're doing on our farms and where we can take it, the better off we'll all kind of be in the end, right? So source that information from multiple people, multiple experts who have experiences. Recognize that it's not all going to work, right? It's not all going to work perfectly, but it's worth the try. So,
yeah, same question to you, Paul, in terms of, when growers are out this winter asking questions, sitting down with their team or building the team around them, what's the big question they do need to be asking?
I think it's going to be, what's your pain point on your farm operation? And it's going back and looking at, the chronological history of what happened this year, and trying to figure out the one or two points that, in my farm operation, what can I do better at? And then going out and seeking it out. There's a lot of good opportunities, like you said, Andrew, with different crop conferences coming up, a lot of information, January, February, March timeframe, seeking out those experts and asking them the questions, and then, hey, what would be plan B, to change that, to make sure, it could be drainage, could be fertility, hybrid choice, the list goes on. And it's, if I look at probably one big thing that we all have to do a better job on is fertility. We've taken a lot of yield off in the last couple of years. We got to feed that crop. Are we doing a good job with the basics, fertility, drainage? Got to get those foundations set right before we start moving up the ladder, moving ahead.
Well, certainly it sounds like, as I am, as you guys always are too, it's one of those things that it's wonderful to be able to look back at the past year and be even more optimistic that next year we're going to solve all of the mistakes we made from the past year, and next year will be even better yet. So, Greg, Paul, thanks for helping me be optimistic for 2024.
Great. I'm glad we could help you be optimistic.
And happy holidays to everyone.
Yeah. Merry Christmas, everyone.
And that does it for our episodes for 2023. But don't worry, we'll be back early in 2024 with a brand new set of episodes covering issues around research, agronomy, and leadership in the industry. So stay tuned to your podcast feed. After all, we're available anywhere you get your podcasts, and we're even on YouTube now with new video episodes. You can follow Pioneer Seeds on Twitter at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.